Hello, my name is Cupin, and you are watching Rappler. Good morning from Washington, D.C. It's quite a gloomy, cold morning here in the capital of the United States. I'm here covering President Ferdinand Marcos Jr.'s official working visit to the United States. He's been here since April 30, East Coast time. And yesterday, actually, specifically, I'm talking to you today, right now, to talk about the bilateral meeting between President Marcos and US President Joe Biden at the White House. That meeting happened May 1 in the afternoon, DC time. In the Philippines, it was early in the morning of May 2. So, just quickly, this is Marcos's second visit to the United States since assuming office. This is also his second bilateral meeting with President Biden. The first one or happened during his first visit to the United States for the UNGAR, the United Nations General Assembly, that happened in New York. This time, he's flying in specifically for an official working visit. The highlight, of course, is the bilateral meeting that happened yesterday. So, just quickly, uh, President Marcos arrived at the White House at the South Portico. Ito yung building na katabi halos or adjacent lang to the West Wing where the Oval Office is located. He arrived a little past 2:45 p.m. Again DC time or mga 2:46 p.m. At kasama niyang bumaba mula sa sakyan si First Lady Luis Araneta Marcos. They were greeted by President Joe Biden and First Lady Jill Biden. After yung parang photo op or video call nila dun sa South Portico, they went straight to the Oval Office. Naglakad sila dun. Kung alam mo yung corridor surrounding the Rose Garden outside the Oval Office. And then inside the Oval Office, they had brief remarks to a pool of media from the Philippines and the White House. Opening statement lang, and then what followed was the actual meeting. So let's talk about what was spoken on record to the media during that very brief opening remarks ni President Marcos at President Biden. Of course, yung nagsimula magsalita ay si President Biden as the host of this bilateral meeting. He made a reference to the last time President Marcos was in the White House. Of course, it's a reference to the late dictator, the father namesake of the current president of the Philippines, Ferdinand E. Marcos Sr., who met with Reagan in 1982, 4 years before the revolution, 4 years before he was ousted from power, 4 years before the Marcos family fled Manila and were forced into exile in the United States in Hawaii. But after that call to nostalgia, if you will, making a reference to the first Marcos president and his ties to the United States, sabi ni Joe Biden, quoting Marcos's statements when they first met in New York City, no, about the changing dynamics of the world and the U.S. and the Philippines as partners. According to President Biden, he cannot think of a better partner than the Philippines, given the changes in geopolitics and the world economy. Again, I've mentioned this several times in the past. The Philippines is one of five treaty allies in the Indo-Pacific of the United States. Ka-level natin or kumbaga kasama natin dun sa treaty partners. You have Australia, South Korea, Japan, and then Thailand. And the US is our only treaty ally. Ano bang ibig sabihin nun? Kasi nagpirma tayo ng Mutual Defense Treaty, which basically means that we can invoke it in case we are attacked or in case the US is attacked. Both sides are attacked. The other country is compelled to come to its defense or to help in its defense. If you recall before, Marcos did say in New York, again during his first visit to the United States, that he cannot imagine a future of the Philippines without the United States. He said so much, like he more or less said the same thing during that brief statement with President Biden in a different way, of course. Sabi nga niya, given the tensions, given the difficulties in geopolitics in the region, the Philippines, it's only natural, according to him, for the Philippines to look at its sole treaty partner for guidance and for help given the murky waters. Briefly, because more or less it's inevitable that this discussion will focus on defense. To talk about the other things that they did discuss, because economy is, of course, the economy rather, and economic relations between the Philippines and the United States is also a huge emphasis of this bilateral meeting. Sa pinag-usapan nila, partnerships for climate change and clean energy efforts, economic cooperation. Announced the President Biden that he will be sending a presidential trade and investment mission to the Philippines, to Manila. This is initially discussed in New York City. So this will be, kumbaga, a delegation of government officials and American private business leaders, in effect, looking into investments in the Philippines. They also announced that Manila will be co-hosting the Indo-Pacific Business Forum. Parang ito yung flagship or parang marquee is the term the U.S. uses, na program of the United States in engaging with the economy of the Indo-Pacific. The Indo-Pacific makes up a huge part of the American strategy, global strategy. And I talked about that in detail in the last time, and we can link you or you can check out Rappler for more about that Indo-Pacific strategy and how the Philippines plays into it. But of course, the focus was Biden, echoing statements he has made in the past. His allies in the administration or his colleagues in the administration, specifically U.S. Vice President Kamala Harris, has said in the past, and other U.S. presidents, frankly, have also said in the past of Washington's ironclad commitment to the Mutual Defense Treaty, to defending Manila, to defending the Philippines, with emphasis nowadays on any incursions or any attacks in the context of the South China Sea. Now, it was Marcos who also said that perhaps because of the geopolitical situation in Southeast Asia, or in more generally, no, in the Asian region, in the Asia Pacific, and in the Indo Pacific. By the way, that the U.S. looks at it, no, we might have, or the region might have, the most complicated geopolitical situation. Briefly, bakit? Una sa lahat, you have the South China Sea. As we all know, China practically claims the entire sea as its own. There are overlapping claims in the South China Sea sa tayo doon. But in fact, the Philippines took China to court. That was under the late President Benigno Aquino III. The decision of the tribunal was released under the administration of the former President Rodrigo Duterte. But China hasn't recognized that ruling. And in fact, under the Duterte administration, we didn't really push forward that ruling. Because partly then, President Duterte or former President Duterte made a much hyped about pivot to China, which didn't really pan out, but that's another topic altogether. So on top of that, we did bring China to court. We face the South China Sea. We are also a strategic location in relation to Taiwan. Again, it's another flashpoint for tension in the region. It involves China again. Taiwan is democratically governed, but China is asserting it as its territory. There have been tensions and movements in the Taiwan Strait, and yung isa sa mga agreements ni President Biden and President Marcos is that they both commit to peace in the Taiwan Strait. Of course, it's mutually beneficial not just to the Philippines and to the United States, but to the rest of the region, for Taiwan to be a safe space for no conflict to rise in Taiwan. That's something that clearly allies of the U.S. are monitoring in the Indo-Pacific. So the commitment, the general strategy of the U.S. in terms of the Indo-Pacific is to keep it free and open, connected, prosperous, secure, and resilient. Of course, you can't erase China out of the equation, but the way the U.S. sees it, they do not want to change China because that's impossible to do. But what they want to do is to shape the environment in which China operates, and that includes tapping their allies in the region. Again, 5 treaty allies. They have other alliances or links to other countries in the Southeast Asia and the general Indo-Pacific area. So they did not speak specifically about China or Taiwan, except to say that both the Philippines and the U.S. Want to keep to keep the South China Sea, the waters open for commerce, for basically to uphold the rule of law in those waters, and for Taiwan to keep it safe, to keep it open, to keep it peaceful. Again, zooming back in on defense, no. This was probably parang indicative of this, as it was up top. So parang, kumbaga, summary of commitments by the United States to the Philippines in the context of the bilateral meeting. So one was the bilateral defense guidelines. Wala pang pag-elaborate kung anong ibig sabihin talaga nito. And it's not clear quite yet if this is what President Marcos has been talking about, because he's been repeatedly mentioning that he wants the MDT, the Mutual Defense Treaty, to evolve. It's not clear how he wants it to evolve, presumably because he wants the evolution to be something that both the U.S. and the Philippines discuss. So we'll see later on. We might expect um, aides or envoys from Manila or Washington to expound on that in the coming months or in the coming weeks. The U.S. also committed to transfer its assets to the armed forces of the Philippines, among those island class patrol vessels, protector class patrol vessels, C-130Hs. Yung caveat dito, we don't know the details of this promised asset transfer. Hindi natin alam kung ano yung deadline. Hindi natin alam kung ano yung state ng ships na to, like how old are they? Are these ships that the US wants to retire anyway? And also, it's hindi pa clearly stated where these assets will be used. Although by the way, by the looks of it, I mean, based on the descriptions of these the vessels that the U.S. mentioned, no, parang these will probably be used to patrol maritime areas. Uh, it's up to you na lang siguro, up to us to imagine what those maritime areas will be. Also, interesting to me at least was the U.S. commitment to invest in sites that are covered by bases under the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, or EDCA. If you recall, the Philippines recently agreed to giving Americans access to 4 more bases in the Philippines. Itong bases na to medyo strategically located, fronting the South China Sea, Taiwan, very crucial given again the geopolitical tensions in the region. Um, there has been criticism and understandable criticism, arguably, from local government officials and even just ordinary Filipinos over concerns. Now, what does it mean to have U.S. troops, U.S. boots in Philippine soil, in Philippine bases? There is a very deeply seeded historical trauma, perhaps, when you talk about U.S. boots on Philippine soil. And also the concern is if these LGUs, these towns, these cities will be dragged into the conflict between the US and China as a result of American presence in these bases. So the US committed to helping these communities in terms of disaster resilience, their economy, things like that. Again, hindi pa talaga ito na flesh out. Kumbaga, talk points or parang summaries pa lang yung nare-release ng White House. So let me walk you through, like what this meeting means for us and for both us and Washington, from both Manila and Washington. So I think it's very interesting to if you have time or if you're interested enough to read through the White House background briefing ahead of Marcos's arrival in Washington, D.C. It really gives you an insight into how senior officials in the Biden administration are seeing this alliance or hope to get from this alliance, no? Parang kunwari, they characterized the meeting as very consequential for Washington. Quote, it was the first kind of meeting at this level of intensity between the US and the Philippines. Again, Marcos is the first president in over a decade to visit Washington, D.C. As you recall, President Duterte made a promise never to visit the U.S. At one point, he banned all his officials from visiting the U.S., and he also lashed out against the U.S. after it canceled or revoked the visa of former PNP chief Bato de la Rosa. So the White House, based on the briefing of senior officials in the Biden administration, said that it's really significant for them, for Marcos to fly into DC and to have a bilateral meeting with President Joe Biden. This is also interesting to me. Senior officials in the Biden administration were very, very careful and cautious about answering questions as to whether Manila was willing to allow U.S. troops to use Philippine bases in the event of war, in the event of conflict in the South China Sea. They were very cautious about asking this. Yung quotes, parang kumbaga, it was very deft walking around the question. Yung pinaka nasagot nila ay they're very confident that both sides are committed to the Mutual Defense Treaty. Pero again, parang you have to clarify that as well, because the Mutual Defense Treaty says if one country is under attack, I mean the other country, not explicitly, but it implies that if one country is under threat, the other will come to its defense or is committed to come to its defense. So that's something that clearly is of interest to Washington, but at the same time, they're very careful about answering that question, even if it's on background. ahead of Marcos's visit. But President Marcos has made it very, very clear that he does not want the Philippines to be a staging site for military operations. He said that in the presidential plane en route to Washington, D.C. He's also said before na hindi daw gagamitin itong EDCA sites as for offensive operations. The Philippines has always highlighted na yung purpose or yung pinaka use of these sites is for disaster operations, for to make sure that if we are hit by disasters, if we do need the help of our allies for evacuation, for relief operations, andun na nakapreposition na yung assets ng US military, for instance, to help the Philippines. But it's hard to avoid thinking that, the US and the Philippines have not disclosed what kind of assets will be prepositioned, what kind of equipment will be placed in those bases. They won't be obliged to, and we certainly do not expect them to disclose freely kung ano yung mga laman ng anong magiging laman ng EDCA bases na ito nang ipapasok na equipment doon. But if you do recall in Balikatan, no, parang the recent Balikatan, which President Marcos attended, actually, at least the final exercise, parang the US side or the US military walked us through the ways in which the two militaries work together. It's quite a difficult undertaking to sync not just on the human level, making sure that commanders understand where whoever needs to go, but it's also difficult to sync yung assets, the weapon systems of both militaries, ang tawag dun yung interoperability. And they did point out that they brought equipment with them from the US for the Balikatan that would allow or at least make it easier for weapon systems of both the US and the Philippines to communicate with each other. They used this and showcased this during an joint littoral exercise, yung joint littoral, kumbaga, land, sea, air na assets, sabay-sabay magtutulungan to hit something. In the case of the Balikatan exercise, a decommissioned Philippine Navy vessel. So, yung pagkasabi sa amin, yung mga equipment na yon, they didn't go into detail kung ano yung mga tawag sa equipment na yon. In the event or upon the request of the Philippines daw, in theory, those assets, those technologies can be used to make sure that the Philippines and the US, the troops from the Philippines and the US, can work together in the event of conflict or an emergency. So again, I'm just talking in theoretical terms, which the White House or the senior White House officials did not want to dive into, because of course in things like this we want to talk specifics and not vague promises. So again, to summarize the bilateral between President Biden and President Marcos, it's really about the defense and economy. Of course, make people-to-people ties, promises to help the Philippines, for instance, with its educational goals in education, offering fellowships to Filipinos and things like that, helping with clean energy, although that's also tied to the economy. But again, I think if you look at it, if you see how, or if you consider how the rest of the world looks at it, how the region looks at it, they will focus on, or the bigger priority for them is obviously the mutual defense treaty and how Philippine and U.S. relations, given a President Marcos and given a President Biden, will evolve or will change. Again, in the context of geopolitical tensions in the South China Sea and the Indo-Pacific. So that's day one, basically, of President Marcos's official working visit to the United States. After that meeting, he did have a Filipino community gathering. That's parang par for course na yun sa mga travels or sa mga trips ni President Marcos throughout the world. He's been to a lot of places around the world with less than a year in office. But in the coming days, actually today, he is set to meet with Vice President Kamala Harris. And then he has tons of meetings lined up. We don't know the details of those meetings quite yet, but we do know that he is expected to meet with American legislators and American businessmen while he is here in DC. And he is also set to speak before a think tank in Washington, DC. And also, he will be given honors at the Department of Defense of the United States. That's happening, I think, tomorrow. By tomorrow, I mean May 3 in DC. That's probably going to be May 3 in the evening in the Philippines. So keep it here, keep it in Rappler. I will still be here reporting on developments and helping you also understand what these developments mean. That's from DC and Manila. We'll walk you through this visit and what it means for the Philippines and the US. Keep it on Rappler, and I'll see you again soon. Bye.